Yo, what is going on, fam? Keezy here from Black Market, and in today's video we're going to be talking about this photo scanned looking texture effect that's really popular right now. It's pretty easy. I'm going to show you basically the texturing process, and then we'll do some color grading stuff to show you how to get that low ink, low saturation, lo-fi 90s kind of a look. And then we will also for some finishing touches, get into Ink Lab towards the end of the video. This step is totally optional. You do not need Ink Lab to follow along with 90% of this. But for those of you that have it and would like to learn a little bit more about it, stick around to the end of the video. Let's do it. Okay, so the first thing that I'm gonna do is just pick an image from Unsplash, and don't worry too much about which image you choose, because the effects that we're going to apply are non-destructive, meaning that you can essentially build the template once and then swap the image out later for anything that you want. So you don't have to have the perfect image right off the bat to do the effect. You can kind of just pick any image, do the effects, and then swap the image out later. So I'll go ahead and drop this in. I like this image. It's already sort of lo-fi and film looking, so it's a good candidate for this process. So I'm gonna go ahead and open up a copy scan texture. This pack of textures is available on our website for download. Link in the video description. I'm sure other textures of a similar variety would work just as well. So I'm just looking for one with a lot of visible scan lines. Something like this or this one. I'm gonna bring in 47. And scale it up and rotate it so that the scan lines are straight on, and then group it, and I'm gonna call that group textures. There will be 3 textures that we'll use, and you could add more if you want, but I think there'll be 3 main textures that we'll use. The first step is just gonna be changing the blend mode from that texture from normal to screen, and that's gonna kind of start off the effect there. And you can see that on this image, which is kind of light, the effect isn't super visible. There's a couple things that we'll do to fix that here in just a moment. The next thing I'm gonna do is bring in a border texture. So for the border, I want something a little more solid. Ours was kind of rotated, so I think I'll use 55. And I'm gonna drag it into position the same way. Holding control, I'm gonna bring the bottom up. And then holding control, I'm just gonna drag each corner into its own spot. Okay. And then I'm gonna use the magic wand with a tolerance of 80 up there and just click on it and kind of double check my line. I think that looks pretty good. And then now I'm just gonna click Alt and the mask icon to create an inverted mask, which leaves us with just the border. So you'll notice one thing about the border, it's that the top here has all these little dots, and the edge is also kind of harsh when you zoom in. So actually 2 things. We're gonna go filter, blur. We'll just kind of blur that up, and then maybe again filter, blur, and then we're gonna go screen for the blending mode. And so now you're not gonna have any of those little dots. Well, you will, but they won't be black. They'll blend in with the image appropriately. And then we're gonna go and click the thumbnail again and do Command M to open up a curves adjustment. And then this way we can kind of make the border bright enough that it's not transparent in any areas that we don't want it to be. Okay, so we're looking pretty good so far. We've got our border and we've got our main scan line texture in place. And I'll show you more about how to customize the scan line and make it more high contrast and more visible in just a minute. Next, we're gonna go back to our downloads, and I'm gonna grab a blank paper texture. These are also available for download on the copy scan page. So if you already have copy scan, these are available to you for free. Just go to the copy scan page, download them. They were added as an update a few days ago, so if you bought copy scan earlier on, you may need to go and download them. Okay, so I'm just gonna turn that texture to multiply. And the reason for adding that is because if you notice in some of these really light areas like this rock, Without it, you're not really getting any texture. The only thing you're seeing is these little white specks, and we actually want some shadow texture as well. It's not super visible, it's pretty subtle, and we can also see it here in the border. So to add a little bit more detail to it, we're gonna hit Control or Command L on the keyboard. And then if we wanted to darken this up, we could take the middle point and just kind of bring it to the right. Something like that. And I think that looks good. And now we've got a nice consistent texture across the entire image, regardless of whether or not it's dark enough for the copy scan texture to really show. And so that's an important step to keep in mind. We're getting a little bit of color cast though from our blank paper texture. You can see in the thumbnail that it's kind of pink. So to fix that, we'll just do Control-Alt-Shift-B and then click OK. That's going to convert it to black and white. And then we'll double click on our adjustment icon for that black and white filter. We could change the opacity to something like 70%. Now we still have a little bit of color coming from our paper, which can help, but it's not so much that it's like overwhelming. And so now this is the result that we have. It's coming along pretty well, but again, we still have this issue where our scan lines are just not that visible. This is completely a preference thing. A lot of people like just subtle. And so if you're going for something really subtle, this might be enough for you already. Like, let's turn the textures off. This is before, and this is after. We still haven't gotten into any color grading or adjustments that we'll make to the base image, or any ink lab, which we'll touch on at the very end of the video, and we're already getting a pretty good result. So now let's edit the texture. So with that selected, I'm gonna go Image, Adjustments, Brightness, Contrast, and use Legacy. Now, Legacy is gonna make the effect a lot more intense, so we'll be able to crank it. So as I do this, you can already see what's happening. As I just turn contrast up, we go from here, and we're immediately able to get those scan lines back in. We have to be careful with this. If we crank it too much, it starts making the effect look kind of cheesy and not very good looking. So we just have to get the right balance here. So play with it, and if you find that it's difficult to adjust, turn it back on normal blend mode and then adjust it on normal blend mode. Because sometimes on screen the image below could be too light or something and it's difficult to see what you're doing. Another thing I'm noticing is that the texture is super green now after applying that. So again, I'm gonna do Control-Alt-Shift-B. This will give us a black and white node. And we can take the blacks down even a little bit here if we want. I think I'll probably leave them around there. And then that's what we've got. I actually like to leave a little bit of color, so I'm gonna take the opacity of the black and white down to 70, just so we get a subtle hint of green, and then I'll put that back on screen. Okay, so now you can see the effect is definitely a lot more visible, and you could crank it even more. You could also duplicate the texture with Command J, and it will be twice as intense. I'm not personally going to do that because I'm going for something a little more subtle. But let's continue. So another thing that we can do is go back to Copy Scan, and let's pull in 57. I like this one because it has a little bit of water spots to it, and it's also subtle enough that it's not going to conflict with our other texture. So with that, I'm going to click Command L or Control, and then bring this middle point up so that the only thing we're really seeing are these little stains and some little dust pieces and stuff like that. This is just going to help this second texture not overwhelm the image. And so now it's just going to add some little details in a couple areas. So let's take that back down. And let's just play with what we can get out of that. So yeah, I think I'll leave it on screen, and the effect is really subtle. You can kind of see it there, and a little bit up here as well. But since this area is so light, it doesn't show. So if we were going to use this on something black, the effect is more visible there. So just keep that in mind. The image that you use underneath makes a big difference on how the textures actually look. So I think we're doing pretty well with textures so far. So I'm going to turn our image back on and then move on to color. So for color, we're going to use some gradient maps and maybe a color lookup table. I will start with gradient maps. So let's click and add a new gradient map. And I'm just going to pick one from the defaults here. Kind of just looking for something that has that retro vibe to it. I think that I like this one a lot. Maybe a little more saturation. And maybe I'm going to bring that down more so that the blue spreads into the mountains just a little better. Okay, but I really like this now, so I'm going to click OK. And if you don't want the gradient map to completely recolor every aspect of your image the same way that it is here, what we could do is go and change our blend mode from normal to something like overlay or soft light. And what you'll see is that you get a little bit of color influence, but it doesn't dramatically change the image. So it's a preference thing. If you want it totally recolored, that's a cool look as well. But sometimes you just need a little subtle boost in color. With gradient maps, something to try is usually just duplicating them. So I'm going to duplicate that and then picking a different one with the second. So this time, since we've added a lot of blue, I'm going to pick something a little bit warmer to kind of bring the color back down to earth. And I actually dig that. Yeah, that looks pretty good. One reason that it's important to use gradient maps is because your digital image that you're working on in Photoshop is going to be perfectly saturated and cross the entire RGB spectrum with no problems at all. But in reality, especially with printed stuff that you're getting out of your home scanner / printer, it's not going to be that way. You're going to lose some saturation and the colors are going to be a little bit more dull. And especially in some shadows, you might find that detail gets lost. And so we can recreate that effect with gradient maps. You want to get crazy with it and really do something fun, you could also do a really bright gradient with just like random colors. I'll show you, for example, what it looks like just using Exograde. And this is a pack available for download on our website. You don't have to pay for it. You could also just make these yourself or make your own gradients, but it's convenient, and if it's something that you're interested in, it's available. You could also just copy what I'm doing here on the screen by following along with the points. So we could get an effect like this and really do something totally different from like the typical look. So that's a good way to get that, you know, just a different, cool, unique vibe with your images. So we've got 3 gradient maps going on. What else can we do? Well, we could use a color lookup table as well. And a color lookup is essentially just a filter for Photoshop. So we'll apply different colors to your image, and you can download different filters online. So just clicking through these different ones, seeing what result you get. If you find one that you like, use it, and that's basically all there is to it. I find that these Kodak ones look pretty good, pretty vintage. So this is without it, this is with it. Again, it's a preference thing. Do you need it? Maybe not. It's up to you. I'll leave it on. And let's group all of those and call this adjustment. Another thing is that if your image was really dark and you wanted to lighten some of the shadows up to make them look more scanned, you could add a levels or even an exposure. So let me delete that. So I'll do this with exposure. Let's add an exposure and then just take the offset up a tiny little bit. And in this particular image, it's not a great example because the image is already so dark. But if the image was, so light, but if the image was darker, for example, here's pure black, and then here's pure black without the exposure. So basically by taking the offset up, you're just bringing up what the maximum black value can be and moving it up a little bit. So you're no longer getting pure black, you're getting whatever you adjusted it to. So pretty straightforward there. Let's get in and do a little bit more. So one other thing to try is to actually make a couple of adjustments to the base image. One thing that I like to do is blur the image a little bit, and this just kind of keeps it on track with our textures. So this image is already pretty blurry because it looks like maybe a film photo or something, but it's especially important if you have like a nice studio photo to give it a little bit of blur. And the next thing I do is go filter, noise, reduce noise, and these are the settings that I usually use. This is because when you're working with an image in Photoshop, a digital image, you're gonna have artifact in the image, pixelation, some noise, digital noise that you wouldn't normally have in a printed piece. So by going through these steps and removing that JPEG artifact, you can kind of smooth the image out and it helps blend a little bit better. So I'm gonna click OK, and there's what we've got. One thing that I'm seeing here is now that our background image is too blurred in comparison to our textures. And so what I like to do is just go on and blur the textures. So I'll go filter, blur, blur, and I'm gonna do that with all of them. It usually looks quite a bit better if the textures are not 100% sharp. So here's the result after blurring. You can see that everything just feels right. Everything blends a little bit better. Our background image here maybe doesn't need it because it's already so blurry. But yeah, I'm digging this so far. So if we wanted to take this a step further, we could use InkLab. So I'm just gonna open up another image. And so this is an example of an image that I've printed and then scanned in really high resolution so that you can see what the printer actually is doing. So all of these little dots that you're looking at here make up the final image. So when you zoom in, you're seeing each individual bit of color that your eyes kind of blend together to form the image. And it's kind of hard to get that result in Photoshop by default. Not necessarily hard, but time consuming for sure, and InkLab automates that process, which makes it sort of viable to go through the work of doing that. But again, this step is totally optional. You don't really need to do this. As we've already seen, the image is looking pretty good already. But yeah, so if we want to take this a step further, this is what we could do. So I'm gonna go inside of InkLab, Mode Advanced, Conversion, Diffusion, Dither. I'm gonna turn shadows off, texture off, and then just make sure that the resample value here matches your document resolution. And then I'm gonna click Effects and make sure Sharp is on. This will just stop InkLab from blurring the result. We'll do that ourselves after. So I'm gonna click play, let InkLab run. Okay, so InkLab just finished running, and let's zoom in so I can show you what it does. You'll see all of these little color dots, and it doesn't look super good here, but the point of it's not really that it looks super good, it's more so that it looks like a replication of the print. So what we're gonna do is just right click and convert to smart object, and then go filter, blur, blur, filter, blur, blur, and this is gonna help smooth out all of the sharpness. And then we're gonna take this and put it underneath our textures. So now, let's toggle those on. this is the result that we get. So you can see all of the little print marks, and I'm zoomed in at 400% here. So this is pretty significant zoom. Right here, this is 100%. So from this level, you can see up here in the mountains, you're getting all of that little pixelation, the little dots of ink, the same that you would in a real print. Now again, you don't need to do this. Here's without it. Here's with it. Without it. With it. So it's up to you. You know, do you want to go through the extra time and the extra step of doing it? Personally, I prefer the look, but it also looks really good without it. It just looks a little bit more printed with it. And so now basically we're done. We can go on Unsplash and drag in another image. So let's just drag that in, or maybe drag this in. And we could recreate essentially this same exact thing now, just by dragging in a new image. So with this image in there, we're zooming in, we can see already we've got the little scan lines, we've got our border, we've got our texture, our adjustments are affecting it. Everything is good to go, just like that, with essentially no additional work needed to be done, unless you want to adjust anything specifically. Let's grab that one. This one's gonna look really good, I bet, just because it's so dark and moody already. Drop that in there. So, yep, looking really good. Of course, you can always go back into your gradient maps and play with that. It does look good sometimes just to go crazy with it and put something in that's different. So, depending on what I'm making, sometimes I might just run my gradient map 100% on normal mode and let it take over the image just for fun. One thing I forgot to mention though is that you can actually alt drag your smart filters, so your blur and your reduce noise, to your new image, and this way you don't have to re-add them manually every time and you can still get the result. So here is with those filters on, and then let me toggle them off. That's with them off. So yep, I like to do that, and I think we're done. I honestly think we're done. I'm pretty happy with how this all worked out. Let me drag those to that as well. So yeah, we've got something good here, you guys. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you were able to get something out of it. Any products that you saw in the video used, such as the texture overlays or ink lab or some of the gradients, are available on beta.blackmarket.co. That is BLKMARKET.co. So again, don't feel like you have to buy this stuff, but if you want to save yourself a little bit of time, or if it's convenient for you, we appreciate the support. If you like the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good stuff, and yeah, thanks for tuning in.